Um, so I can start us off. Thank you so much again for joining us today to learn about open education data. We were really excited to see so many people interested in this more focused topic. So my name's Dulcie. I'm part of the DataKind UK team, and we're joined today by Tom Shirley, who I will introduce properly in a second. But Tom, if you want to go to the next slide. I just wanted to briefly introduce DataKind. So we are a small UK charity, and our vision is that the whole sector is able to embrace data use to become even more impactful. And so we do that. If you go to the next slide. We have a number of different programs. We do one-to-one exploratory projects with third sector organizations, charities, social enterprises. We do a number of trainings and workshops. This is one of them, but we've done a whole host of other trainings and workshops, and we provide advice and guidance on responsible data use as well. Through things like resources on our website and also through lighter touch support that organizations can receive directly. I will say if you've applied for support this year and not heard back, we are working through our very, very long list of support requests, and we're a small staff team, so we're going to try and get back to everyone that we can. And thank you for your patience. So just a bit about this series on the next slide. So today we're talking about using open data in the context of helping young people and helping pupils thrive. And this is part of a series of events and trainings that we're delivering in partnership with the Insight Infrastructure team at Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And their goal is to democratize access to high quality quantitative and qualitative data and evidence through open collaboration and innovation to help tackle injustice and inequality in the UK. So we are very grateful for their ongoing support, and I think that this topic fits very nicely with their broader goals. So if you'd like to check out some of the previous events that we've done through this program around generative AI, you can find the recordings on our website. We also have a upcoming panel discussion that's co-hosted with PBE, and that's about live data, real-time data, when and how and if it's useful for creating effective policies. So that should be a really interesting panel discussion coming up. And you can find that again on our website. So today, our goal is that by the end of the session, you are all going to leave with some knowledge about some of the key open data sets that relate to education and how you can access them. We hope that with that, you'll have a better sense of how you can use this data to target specific schools meeting certain criteria, whether that's schools with high rates of absence or schools with high proportions of pupils from certain demographics or those with particular needs. Those are questions that we see all the time with partners that we work with. And we also want you to know what kind of open data is available around attainment and how that could be used to look at, for example, school performance over time. So we'll be giving you some really specific use cases. And again, this will be recorded, so you don't have to worry if you didn't, follow all of the steps. You'll have access to this after the session. So in terms of the agenda, we're just going to do a quick poll of who's here. We're going to talk through briefly what data is there, how do you find it, who publishes it, and how can you even find a list of what the relevant data sets are that might be useful for you or your organization. Then we're going to talk through 3 or 4 case studies about using this data for campaigning, using it for targeting the right schools, and using it to evaluate outcomes. We'll have a short break, and then we have hopefully a pretty chunky time for some Q&A or about the content, or if you have a specific problem that you'd like Tom has nobly offered to try to solve in real time if possible, we'll try to tackle that. So that's the plan for today. Briefly, we just wanted to find out a little bit about who's here, who you're serving, your relationship with open data, what you're hoping to get out of it this session. So I'm just going to launch a poll. Can everybody see that? There should be 4 questions. So we have a question, who are your direct beneficiaries? Are you working directly with young people? Are you an infrastructure organization? What's your main mission area? Are you working in education, or maybe you're working in housing or employment? You can choose more than one. And your relationship with open data. You've heard of it, never used it, you're an expert. And then lastly, like what you're hoping to get out of here today. So just give folks a couple minutes a short time to fill that in. And from the chat, it looks like we've got some folks joining, definitely from some education charities. It's nice to see you, Barbara, from Into Science. And we've also got some private sector folks, which is really interesting as well. Politics and action, that's great. Okay. Almost everyone's done the poll. The poll, not the pool. Okay. Looks like most people's direct beneficiaries are children and young people, which is not surprising, but 75% of people are working with children and young people, and half working with young adults. A couple people said they're doing something else, so I'd love to know who that is. We've got about half the audience here working in education and learning. Lots of folks here from youth services, mental health. It's really mixed crowd, which is great. And then in terms of your relationship with open data, so about 25% of people have said they've heard of it but never used it. So you're in a great place here, because we're going to give you some really clear examples, starting from quite simple, moving to more complex. Half the folks here have poked around open data sets once or twice. Love to know in the chat like what your favorite open data sets are. And then there's 5 people who are regular users. Show me what's new. So we've got something for you as well at the end. You can tell us if it's an open data set that you've seen before. I hadn't seen it, so stay tuned for that. In terms of what brings you here today, most people are just generally curious about what's out there, but there's about 5 people who've said that they're either seeking data for a specific project or have a challenge with a particular data set. So let's see if we can help you tackle those in the Q&A. Oh, I always forget that it lets me share the results. So there's the results if anyone wants to see the actual data. All right, on to the next important part, which is introducing today's speaker. Tom is a wonderful DataKind UK volunteer, but also more relevant to this session, the founder of Illustrating Impact, which is an organization that supports schools and youth organizations since 2013 to use data more effectively to help improve services for young people. They've done lots of different projects with schools and open data, and he has a recent project called Beyond the Classroom, which is helping school charities understand their local communities and track their local partnerships. And really, as a DataKind UK volunteer, he's also been our go-to whenever we need help understanding education open data sets. So I am really, really grateful, Tom, that you were able to come and share your knowledge and experience with everybody here today, and look forward to learning from you. So with that, I am going to pass over to you, Tom, and looking forward to the rest of the session.
Great, thanks, Dulcie, and yeah, thanks to everyone who's joined. It's great to see some familiar old faces. Old, not literally old, but from old back in the day. I've worked, as Dulcie mentioned, I've been working for sort of 10 to 15 years in this sector, so go back quite a long way in terms of working with organisations, some of which are on this call. But it's great that there's some organisations I've not worked with before, and a lot of the work I do, as Dulcie mentioned, is helping schools and charities use data to better serve young people. And some of that might be from their sort of from school systems directly, or from information that charities are collecting, but a lot of it is from open data. So that's stuff which is published, freely available online, And that's the main focus of today's conversation. So I'm always happy to take questions on other sort of data projects. But today we're going to focus on open data, which has the benefits listed here. So it's freely available. It can be a bit tricky to find, which is one of the things we're going to touch on today in terms of the best places to kind of stay updated on where it is. It's also regularly published typically. So either once a year around the academic year, if it's DFE data, or maybe a bit more frequent or less frequent than that, depending on the data set. So stuff like attendance comes out termly, for example. Other things like indices of multiple deprivation, which isn't a DFE data set, but that one comes out sort of every 3 to 4 years. But there is generally a commitment from the people that publish these to keep doing them. So that allows you to do some trends over time, that type of thing, either for targeting, which we're going to talk a bit about today. So you might want to work with schools, for example, that have had the biggest increase, say, in persistent absence. So you can compare 2 years to get that information. Or there's maybe some kind of initial work you can do around evaluation, which we'll also touch on if you're working with schools over a long period of time, and you've got, especially if you've got a whole school approach, that can be quite helpful. Then the third point we've got here is that it can be quite efficient once you've kind of got into the spreadsheet and got your head around what's going on with them. Typically, they contain data for either every school in the country or every area in the country if you're talking about community-related data. So you can, once things are set up, you can quite quickly filter to look for a different local authority, for example. So if you're focused in one area and you want the same data for another area, that's all in one place rather than having to go to different local authorities to get that information. And then finally, it tends to be high quality data. So there's a lot of processes in place for how these things are published and checked. They do occasionally, the departments who publish these things do occasionally have to amend them, but it tends to be quite small things that get changed. So you can trust kind of what you're looking at with them. And then moving on to who publishes the data. So the stuff that I use most frequently comes from government departments. So there are other sources, but typically the national ones, which we're going to focus on today, do come from the national government departments. So the big one for this audience in terms of youth services is often Department for Education, although not always. So that's obviously all the stuff related to schools, which will come on to the specifics in the next slide. You also have DWP. Their information can be quite useful around social security and universal credit and that type of thing. So there's some overlap with things like free school meals in terms of schools will collect that information and publish it, but it's primarily a social security sort of family income related measure, which the DWP can have more information on at times. And then he says higher education statistics authority, I think it's definitely higher education. So that's for universities. So if you're interested in either working directly with universities or on things around potentially social mobility, progression from secondary school to university, that type of thing, then HESA can be quite helpful in terms of those admission statistics and outcomes whilst pupils are on their higher education courses. There are other ones which we'll touch on, and I'm happy to take questions at the end. So some of the ones, particularly if you don't have as much of a school focus, you might want to take things from like the NHS, for example. So they have data around, especially on early years, like health checks, early development, height and weight measurements, all of that type of thing. So I'm happy to go into those, but today we're going to sort of focus on the DFE stuff to keep it manageable. And then for where the data is, I'm going to come on to an example shortly for the specific site that I find most useful. But this is just to say that there are a few different things out there that aim to kind of collect the data itself. So have, like a place where all the spreadsheets live, or at least kind of signpost to where those spreadsheets are. So these ones that are listed on the slide can be quite helpful. And there's a few other of these, but as I say, I'm going to sort of come on to a specific example shortly of where the data lives. Okay, so on to specifically what's available. So I won't have time in this session to go through everything, but always happy to take questions. So if you've got a specific thing you're trying to do, as Dulcie mentioned, we can cover that either at the end of the session, or happy for my email to kind of be shared around and take questions on where specific things might be. But the things that are most commonly used are on this slide. So with the Department for Education, there's attendance and suspensions, which we're going to look at today, which has always been important, but is increasingly kind of relevant given the increases since COVID. Then we've got things around attainment, so that's statutory exams essentially and tests. So that tends to be available for the earlier years ones. It can be trickier to get it for individual schools. So like, yeah, for those who work in the early years foundation stage, for example, or even like year one phonics, those typically aren't easy to get for individual schools. But as you sort of progress through Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4, there's more and more data that gets published on that type of thing. Then we've got a whole kind of suite of things around pupil characteristics and demographics. So that's another one we're going to have a case study on today. So there's a lot of different elements to that around, so the things we have listed here are the main ones. So free school meals, special educational needs, that type of thing, which often can be relevant for the types of pupils that people are trying to serve in a targeted way. Then we won't come onto this one today, but we've got a little bit on funding actually, which people may find interesting on school funding. But there is a whole kind of category around school finance and workforce, which is, so all these other things I've spoken about previously are at the school level and a pupil focus. So they're percentages of pupils. Essentially, this stuff is more around the teacher focus. So that'd be things like pupil teacher ratios, average salaries, all types of things like that that go into sort of the operations of a school, school spending and school income, which we will talk a little bit about today. So that's another bucket. And then the final one here on DFE is destinations of pupils. So that's either after Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5, where do pupils go on as their next step on their educational path. So particularly for schools with sixth forms or colleges, the Key Stage 5 one is most interesting. So that will contain information about whether pupils go on to higher education, employment, further training, or none of those things, which would essentially be a version of NEET. It's not technically the same thing as NEET, but it's a version of that. That's an interesting thing to keep track of, and you can get the same thing for after Key Stage 4. So for schools that don't have sixth form provision, if they're just sort of year 7 through year 11, then that could be quite a useful one to have a sense of where people go on to after attending that school. And then, just to quickly touch on some of these other ones. I talked a bit about this already. So DWP, a lot of that would be around children impacted by benefit reforms or in households that are claiming universal credit or job seekers allowance or other things of that nature. HESA would be around the outcomes, as I mentioned. So outcomes, admissions, all of that type of stuff. And then ONS, we're not going to get too much into this in this session, but ONS is where most of the data lives that's more focused on areas rather than schools. So a lot of this stuff we're going to look at and I've spoken about so far, the school is kind of the key unit really, although the data is also published aggregated up to the local authority. So all the schools within a local authority, you can get that information, which we'll touch on, but it's still the schools rather than the areas. And so ONS has information such as indices of deprivation, census, other things of that, like that, which people will probably be familiar with. And those are tied to places like of different levels. So that might be wards, for example, or constituencies or something like that. So I'm not going to get too much into that today, but as Dulcie mentioned, I've got some work ongoing that does focus on making that accessible for schools. So I'm happy to take questions on that after the session. Okay, great. So getting into the specifics. So just as a quick recap, I'm going to show people where some of this data is. Then we've got a few case studies where I'm going to hopefully just sort of show the spreadsheets and hopefully help people find those a bit more accessible themselves. So we're not going to look too much at the kind of the final reports and products and stuff you can create with this data. We're kind of focusing really on getting people kind of up to speed with what's available. And then, I'm happy to talk about sort of where you can take this data if you have more time. But the first thing is this website. So I'm going to jump around slightly. So I'm just going to share this. So this website, which we'll make accessible, if you search for research and statistics, gov.uk, you'll probably find it. And this is the one I find most helpful as a starting point. So what you can do here is you can filter for organizations. I've already got this filtered for DFE, but you can look at, there's a big long list of kind of all the government departments. And then the two main things which I find useful are the things which are upcoming, which is what I'm looking at now. So this is basically telling us that tomorrow actually is a big day for me and people who live in this world. Quite a lot's coming out. So there's stuff around looked after children, year 4 multiplication check, suspensions, etc. So I won't go through all of this now. People can do a bit of that on their own time, but this gives you, if you kind of scroll through this, it gives you a nice sense of what's available and specifically when it's going to be available. And we'll get into some of these specifics shortly. So that's upcoming. And then you can also, on the left here, you can change this to say published. And that, as you would expect, is stuff that's just come out, sort of listed in, again, in kind of time order. So last week, there's a relatively big release that people are probably familiar with if you work in secondary and post-16 around A-level results, which came out last week. So that's an example we're going to look at today. But again, this is something where you can just kind of scroll through, and they do have the options here to kind of subscribe or to email lists and that type of thing. So if you are interested in this and you don't mind getting those emails occasionally, I would recommend that, because it just it'll give you a reminder that something's been published by a specific department. So this one, hopefully, that's kind of a useful starting point. And then, as I say, there's a bunch of other similar things a bit like this, but this is the one I would personally recommend, particularly if you're kind of looking for a particular department and government sort of gov.uk style data, which is normally a good starting point. So I'll just jump back now to the slides. So as I mentioned, we're going to look at 4 case studies, hopefully, if we have time. And they're all, the first one's very simple, and then the last one gets a little bit in the weeds of GCSE data, but hopefully is interesting for people to see. So this first case study here, we've made these examples that hopefully reflect people on this call in some regards, at least some of these examples. So this example would be someone who works in comms, David, and fundraising for an education charity that in this case is focused on social mobility and disadvantaged pupils gaining access to higher education, which we've touched on a bit already. And what David's looking to do is ensure that their social media campaigning is tied to the data that's just been released. So that example, which I'm going to jump back to shortly on, that came out last week, would be a relevant one for David. So I'm just going to jump back now. Apologies if I give anyone a headache jumping around. I'll try and keep it relatively under control. So so we're thinking here about top level. You're just you don't necessarily need to get into spreadsheets and stuff. What can you do? So this example, which I'll go to now, a lot of these pages look a bit like this, and they just have another follow-on link. So it can be a bit confusing, but just to let you know, normally there's another click you have to do to get through to the actual page. And then a lot of these pages, which used to be called statistical first releases, I'm not sure if they use that terminology now, but these kind of data releases will often have a page associated with it that looks a bit like this. So I'm going to go through some of this in detail. But for this case study we're looking at now, when you're kind of, you want the top level information, maybe to update sort of your social media, or maybe for strategy kind of discussions in like senior leadership, that type of thing, there is quite a lot of information that they tend to make available, sort of some analysis of the data essentially. So there's always this headline section which pulls out the milestones, sort of the key KPIs or whatever you would call them for the data, and then sort of a few bullet points on what their analyst team at the DFE in this case have found most interesting from the data. So this can be a really good place to start, where you don't need to be getting into spreadsheets or anything. And an example would be, average A-level result is B minus, and this is essentially saying that hasn't changed from last year. And then as you go down here, there's a few other bits which we're going to come back to for when we get into the more kind of involved examples. But just to quickly show you these sections where they exist can also be quite helpful. So this is, if you're interested in Key Stage 5, this can kind of lead you through some other things. So I'm not going to get into these now, but in this case, these are transition matrices. So that's basically saying like what grades people got from different starting points at Key Stage 4, and also related dashboards. So you can kind of spend a bit of time if you are new to this stuff, this will give you a good set of resources to explore. And then each of these sections can be useful in different ways. So the ones which I often find most useful is the stuff by region or local authority. So this one's just got a big table, but then further down it's got the results by local authority. So this is often at least a starting point. So yeah, sometimes it's limited, obviously, exactly what you can do with this, but I find it to be a useful starting point, especially if, say, for example, you're working in London on, in this case, it's A levels, then you would probably be interested to know that Newham has an average A level entry point score of 40 compared to Tower Hamlets 30, which is just next door. So that's more than a grade. I think a grade is 8 points. That's not super relevant for this conversation, but that's more than a grade different at A level. So things like that, if you're talking about sort of social media and strategy, it's a good place to start. And the other one, which tends to be quite useful, is the one split by disadvantage, particularly in this case for David, who's that's one of their focus groups. This will often give you this. So this is just national, but it'll just give you the national picture on disadvantage gaps. So again, this one is showing us that there's a 5-point gap in terms of A levels for disadvantaged students versus non-disadvantaged students. So that's more than half a grade in this case. And further up this page, it says that hasn't changed since last year. So all of that's kind of interesting, just initial insights, I suppose, but without having to get into too much technical work. So that's quite a simple one. I'll maybe pause there. I'm going to jump back to the slides, but I'll take a quick pause there just to check if there's any immediate questions or that we're all kind of on track. But I think that's kind of the simplest example. And then the next one I'll pull up is we're going to download some data and look at the spreadsheet. So yeah, I'll just take a quick pause there and get the slides back up. Oh, sorry, 1 sec, it signed me out. Let's see if it...
So yeah, if there's any kind of clarification questions or bits that were confusing, we can tackle them as we go. If there's questions like, oh, how do I do this thing? We can park those to the end, but we just want to make sure we're not losing anybody. So if that if there were any clarifications, please feel free to like raise your hand with the Zoom function or physically wave. Otherwise we can move on to the next example. Okay, I'm not seeing any overt hand gestures, so we can carry on if you like, Tom.
Yeah, 1 second.
Sure.
Just sign me out, which is helpful. I'll just get signed back into my email.
So for that use case, we were just while Tom's getting the slides back, we were imagining that perhaps David would want to kind of make sure that he was aware of when the latest A-level results are being released, and he could sign up to the notification emails, and then he could time his social media announcements to say campaigning-esque things. I'm not in comms, and this is going to be incredibly apparent, but to say things like, the disadvantage gap persists in A levels, or if he's working in a particular area, like we're still seeing a grade level discrepancy, but between Newham and Tower Hamlets in terms of A level results, and use that to provide evidence for their ongoing campaigning functions.
Yeah, thanks, Dulcie. I think I am back, so apologies for that. So second case study, as I mentioned, we're going to sort of level them up. So this one is quite a common case study in the work I do. So we're charity or third sector organisation is working with a particular pupil group in this case, then yeah, often they want to identify schools who might benefit in terms of having pupils of that characteristic at the school. So we've got two examples on this. This one is around ethnicity. So this would be Maya working on a mentoring and tutoring service that's particularly focused on Black and Black British young people to access higher education. So yeah, they've got a kind of ethnicity focus there. And then the second one, which I'll just quickly bring up now, I may just run them together. This one is John, which is more around free school meals. So that's a very common example. And to make this one a bit more interesting, I'm going to use a data set which hopefully not everyone has seen. So people who've a bit more experience with this data, they'll know where to get free school meals in the standard way. But I'm going to use a bit of a different data set around school funding, which hopefully people will find interesting who've used this data a lot. So I will jump back to the links again. So in terms of pupil characteristics, so if you're just interested in this in general, this is the particular data set I would recommend. So it's called Schools, Pupils and Their Characteristics, and it's published once a year. This one doesn't contain much in the way of SEN, so I'm not going to get in, unless we have time at the end, I'm not going to get too much into that, but there's a different data set which is very similar, which is called Special Educational Needs, and I think it's published at the same time, and it looks a lot like this, but that one will go into, if you have a focus on that. So I think some people in the sign-ups were talking a little bit around special educational needs and maybe a focus on social and emotional mental health needs, for example. That would be where you would go for that. So that would give you for every school how many pupils and what percentage for pupils that at least have a sort of a recognised diagnosed need, either care plan or SEN support around social and emotional needs, or any of the other categories, autism spectrum disorder, all of these categories will be in there. So that's a bit of an aside, but the main one, which I find useful, is this one, schools, pupils and their characteristics. And then on all of these things, we're going to look at, the link is here. So it says download all data, zip. So if you click that, you'll basically get a zip folder, which I've already downloaded. So in this case, we're looking at this one. So what you download will look like this. I'm just going to step through this as an initial step. Hopefully, I know that'll probably be a bit small on the screen, but hopefully we can, hopefully it'll still be helpful just to talk through what's in here. So we've got a zip folder, and then to talk through it, there's 3 subfolders. The one which I would go to first would be data guidance, which I'll come on to. Then there's a data folder, and then for some of them, there'll be a file which they call supporting files. And in this case, we do need it because that's where they've put the school level file. So the data guidance, yeah, this should be in every download. And I'll bring one of these up. Again, this is going to be a little bit hard to see on the screen just because of how they publish it, but I can tell you what's in it. And yeah, it's helpful just to look at them anyway. But in this case, it's a text file. And what it will do is it will have an initial description at the top of what's in this general release. So it'll just give you, basically an introduction of what's available. It'll give you some technical kind of comments on what certain things mean. So like in this file, if there's an X instead of a number, it means not applicable. Sometimes that will mean a different thing, like fewer than 5 pupils or that type of thing. And then what's especially useful typically is that then for each of those files that are in the zip folder, they'll tell you what geographic levels are in it. So in this case, we've got in this folder, in this file, there'd be LA data, national and regional. So nothing to do with schools in that one. They'll give you the time points that are in there. So some of them will just be latest year. Some of them, they just put the latest year in the same file, which is more helpful for me typically. So they just kind of build up the big file, which I'll show you. And then all of these things will have kind of codified column names, which there are benefits to that in some sense, but the disadvantage to it is that they're not typically intuitive. Or some of them are more intuitive than others, but to be sure of what they are, you really need to check this file, and this will tell you exactly what it is. So these ones are actually mostly relatively simple, other than maybe FTE, so that's full-time equivalent versus full-time pupils. So yeah, just to say really that as a first step, especially if you haven't used this data before, I would recommend reading through this guidance document that's in there. And then in our case, I think the focus will just jump straight. So in the data file, just to cover it quickly, what we have is typically things which are at national and local authority level. So if you are interested in that, then you can, yeah, these will be smaller files, and they do sometimes have more in the way of breakdown. So if you're interested in a very specific kind of pupil group, it might be that you can get that at the national level, but they wouldn't give you that for every school because it's the numbers will be too small basically. But in this case, we're just going to go ahead and jump to the school file. So this from that data guidance, you should be able to identify which file it is, and then I will pull this specific one up. So this, we're going to try and look at a few spreadsheets. I know this might be a bit daunting or just tricky to get the value of on the screen, but hopefully I'm going to try and step through it, and then hopefully, it'll just make it a bit more accessible for people if you did want to go away and have a look at these or look at the recording and pause it. But hopefully this is helpful. So this is often what they look like. So it'll be basically a table with, in this case, it's schools. Every row is one school, but that's something which you kind of have to work out, which I'll show you. And then they're just like a million columns in this case going off to the right-hand side. So you kind of have to work out which one is most interesting to you. So what I would normally do when I open these files is, as I say, first work out what the unique combination of things are. So often these columns at the start will be, so you might have multiple rows per school essentially, and you can get this from the guidance, or you can just have a click around. So for example, in this case, this is telling me, it may not show actually the filter options, but it's showing me that there's only 1 year of data in this file. So now we know, and you can also just do a quick check of how many rows are in this table, but I can just, in this case, I can tell you that it's 1 row per school. Some of the other ones which we look at won't be. And what we can do, what I'd quickly do is basically highlight the columns that I'm interested in. So in this case, we've got school here. So I'd highlight that. So that's your school name. You might be interested in local authority name. And then because we're interested in ethnicity, I would search and then highlight these columns. So I'm going to do this relatively quickly, just in the interest of time. But these columns are the ones that you might be interested in. So we've got, I'll just give me 1 sec. I'll just make this a bit more legible. So in this case, this would be number and percentage of pupils that identify with a dual ethnicity, so white and black Caribbean. And then, you could have the same thing for white and black African. And then further to the right here, you would have the categories for Caribbean, African, and any other black background. So these are kind of all the technical terms that the DFE uses. So different people will use different terminology, obviously, around this. But this would, if you're working with this file, these would be kind of the columns you would want to use. So I'd do all of that, and then what I typically then would like to do is hide everything else. So this one's got a lot of columns about how many pupils are a part-time in every year group, which I've never found useful in 15 years, but I'm sure it's useful for someone. So I'd hide all of those, and then potentially hide these ones as well. And then what we're looking at now is kind of a bit more manageable in terms of a list of our schools here. And these are the columns that we're interested in. And then if you didn't have a particular focus on any one of these, then what you might want to do would be to add a simple a total column. So I'll just quickly do that now. So if you wanted to do as a percentage, I may get this wrong doing it quickly, but it'll be something like that. That would be all of those different kind of subcategories combined into one. And then the type of thing you might want to do then, if you were Maya in this case, would be to sort on that column from highest to lowest. And let's say you're interested in Barking and Dagenham, for the sake of argument, a particular local authority. And now what we've got here is all the schools, state-funded schools in Barking and Dagenham. sorted on the percentage of pupils who identify as any category that's related to the ethnicity of Black or Black British. And then this would give you a sense that, yeah, so you may have, it may be that you, yeah, it varies on what you're looking at, but essentially that would give you some insights on which schools in Barking and Dagenham might benefit from your program if you're looking at that. So that's, yeah, kind of a whistle-stop tour. Or maybe I'll pause there and just check if that's, yeah, if people are following that, or if there's any clarifications I need to make.
Could you just zoom in for a second, just so we could see even like the
Oh, yeah,
top few
sorry.
rows? Um,
Is that a bit better?
yeah, that's definitely better. Okay, so
Okay.
so the school with the highest percentage of pupils from like who are mixed ethnicity, like white and black African, and or white and black Caribbean or African or any other black background. The school with the highest percentage there is St. Joseph Catholic Primary School. And so I guess you could
Mm.
also if you were interested in like percentages, that's one thing, but you could also look at like the total number, for example. Um, or you could filter this. Could you filter this by type of school? Like if you were only working with primary school or secondary schools?
Yeah.
That might be a
Yeah.
column
So
that you've hidden.
yeah, no, normally I probably hidden it, but yeah, there tends to be a phase column in here. So yeah, if you were just looking at a particular phase of school, yeah, you could do that type of thing. Yeah, and then just to briefly touch on, so that in this file, I won't go into all of these now, but this file also has things around language. So this is EAL type data, FSM data is in here, and a few other things. So yeah, this one can be quite a good starting point if if your initial focus is around pupil demographics. But I'll maybe quickly jump onto the other file which I mentioned, which maybe people won't have seen as much of. So I'll just close this one down.
Just before you close, just one quick
Yeah,
question. So I
yeah,
just
sure.
wanted to clarify, and there's a question in the chat as well, which we can come to, but
Yeah.
so is this only state school data or is it all schools?
Um, it varies on the data you're looking at. I think
Okay.
this one might include independent schools, but a lot
Okay.
of them won't. So yeah, there's different like reporting requirements. Yeah, you have to be a bit careful, but my focus tends to be on state-funded schools anyway. But
Okay.
yeah, if you're interested in independent schools in particular, you may find that you run into some gaps in some of these data sets for that.
And sorry, two other quick points. So I think our thought with this as well is that, say you were looking to expand in a particular area, from this you would be able to have like a list of like the top 10 schools that meet your criteria that you could potentially start exploring for partnerships. Or maybe you are already working in an area and you want to know uh which if there's any schools that you're missing potentially, or maybe the demographics have changed. It could be a way to look at that. So if you're not working in Barking and Dagenham yet, here are potentially the schools that you could pursue. The one other thing I just wanted to clarify is you said like the first thing that you want to do is figure out what is a row? Is a row an individual school or is it a school? Like could a row could one school have more than one row? And is that defined in the data guidance under a geographical level, or where do you figure that information out? So just
It
by kind of
can
looking at the data.
Yeah, it can vary. The most common ones will be year. So that's definitely one to check. So like all of these files will start with what time period they're talking about. And yeah, often they'll have multiple years stacked together. Um, the other one, which we'll look at, I think, with attendance data, is that they might have rows per pupil characteristic. So yeah, in this case, it's a bit hard to imagine, but if you're looking at attendance, for example, you might have a specific row for disadvantaged and then another row for not disadvantaged or not known to be disadvantaged. So that's the other thing to be careful of. And then in that case, you normally want the one that they call total. So yeah, you do have to be, yeah, to some extent you have to explore them. And the other check which I would do if I was using this data for a project would be if you think it's for an individual school, then there's like the URN is the unique identifier for schools. So you could filter this thing for that URN and then check that you've only got one row. And if you've got multiple rows, then that, there's something going on where you can kind of check. Or the same is true for local authorities. If you're looking for Camden data, if you quickly just filter for only Camden and you've still got multiple rows of data, then normally you want to be a bit careful that you're picking, that kind of what you're picking up, essentially, and not kind of potentially being misled on what that row is about.
Yeah, and there was a quick question in the chat about you can see this at school level for different local and filtered by local authority, but is it then also aggregated at borough level? Is it I think that was one of the different data sets in the same folder. You could look at the school at the pupil characteristics at local authority level as well. Is that true?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
true. So pretty much all of them will have that. So in this case, it will be, I think, that one. I won't open it now because it'll get confusing. But yeah, the short answer is that they'll always be. So that is where the data guidance is useful. So you want to look for where the geographic level is. It says local authority, but not school. And yeah, those ones will tend to be a bit more manageable as well because there's obviously fewer local authorities.
Super. Okay, sorry, I'll let you carry on.
No worries. Thanks, Dulcie. So I'll shut this one down and then I'll just go to another file. So the other one, which I'll show you the link very quickly. So the other one, which I find useful around sort of if you're thinking about pupil demographics, is actually the school funding data, which not everyone is familiar with or wouldn't kind of reach for this one necessarily. But this is where the link is, just so we've kind of got that. And then I'll go to the folder where I've downloaded it already. So it is this one. And I won't go through all that detail again, but you can see it's kind of got the same idea of data guidance data. And then what I want to look at here is this supporting file. And I'll zoom in here as well. So what this file is for every school has one row in here. So I'll just zoom in to hopefully make this a bit easier to see. So every row is a school. And this one's actually a bit more kind of intuitive which is nice as well in terms of the column names make a bit more sense. And it's got phase and local authority if you wanted to filter down on that. And then each of these rows is a pound amount of funding that the school received in this academic year for different reasons. So I'll come back to this, but this has got quite a nice thing here where if you want to just look for a school to get a sense of how the data is structured, they've got a little tool here which they built, which is the type of thing you can put together with any of these data sets. And this allows you to put in one school and it will kind of pull out the data for that school, which is quite helpful to give you a sense of how the table's structured as well. And so what this is saying is that this school, which I picked at random, gets about 600,000 basic entitlement money. And then I won't go through all of these rows now. I'm happy to have conversations with people about what all of this stuff means. But basically, that's a lot of people on this call will know this already, but that would be kind of your core per pupil funding. But then what all of these other things tend to be are money that you receive either for FSM or for the fact your pupils live in deprived areas, even if they don't claim FSM. So that's what this DataKind stuff is. And then there's also money for EAL mobility, so recently arrived pupils and low prior attainment. And then further down here, they split out pupil premium money, basically, and free school meals and all, like various different things, which again, I won't have time to go into right now. But the thing that's relevant is that I think, so it's kind of interesting that it's in pound amounts for different case studies. You might find that useful. So it's not pupil counts, but you can quite easily do. So I was going to do this. I think I won't do it in the interest of time, but just to explain what I would do, you can do, so like what percentage of a school's budget do they get for reasons related to pupil deprivation would be one example. So what I would do is combine this row with the pupil premium row, which is further down, which is another form of, it should be like, it's very related to this basically. And then do that as a percentage of their total funding, which you can find at the bottom here. And then again, you can kind of filter and sort based on that, but that gives quite a nice, in my opinion, that gives potentially a bit more of a rounded sense of than just FSM. So that might help you pick up schools, for example, where for whatever reason the uptake of FSM is low. So the FSM numbers in the previous data we looked at would appear to be low, but because this brings in Idaki and some other things, might give you a bit more of a rounded sense of the type of pupils at the school, or you might have very specific interest in EAL or schools. So if you're doing kind of catch-up work so this would mostly be for secondaries, where pupils are arriving at the secondary with Key Stage 2 results that are below the kind of targeted level, and so schools would receive some money for that. Typically not a large amount, but in relative terms, it kind of gives you a sense of, okay, relatively speaking, which secondary schools have pupils that might need to do some work around transition from year 6 to year 7 in that case. So yeah, I just thought I'd quickly show this file and have to take questions on it. But it's funding related, but because at least some element of school funding is tied to specific pupil needs, you can kind of get some interesting insights out of this file, I tend to find. So yeah, I'll pause there, just check if there's any other initial questions. Otherwise, we'll move on to looking at a bit of kind of outcome related data as the next step.
Are there any clarification questions on this one? I know it's quite a lot to go through. Somebody did ping me a question, Tom, which was so this data set where you're looking at kind of funding that a school receives, would you be able to use this sort of data set to find schools that might be similar to the schools that you're already working with or similar to each other? I'm not sure if the person who messaged me this wants to come off mute, you're welcome to do so if there's a particular use case.
Hi, it was me. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Belinda, how are you?
Yeah, I was just wondering about, similar schools, and thinking sometimes you're matched with another school that somebody, perhaps in the DFE or somewhere else thinks you are similar to, and then you look and you think, actually, we're not. Can you be really focused on getting another school that is almost exactly like yourselves, so they can really work out whether the things you're doing in the context you're delivering them are working potentially?
No, that's a good question. That's a type of work that I do look at. It's a bit tricky to do it on the fly, but you can do it based on. So that at least the way I would do it typically would be to choose the things that you're interested in. So in this case, if it was funding, for example, you'd choose like 2 or 3 of these, but it could be demographics or combination. So you'd take those factors, and then there's an analysis you can run, which says how, like across all of those things, how different are you, basically. So the fewer, like if you just included one thing, it would essentially just be like sorting the list like we did earlier on what you're interested in and just seeing, okay, there's 5 schools above me and 5 schools below me on that one thing. But it gets a bit more complicated if you wanted to do it across free school meals, attendance, outcomes for pupils or something, but it is possible to do. So maybe that's something that we could pick up in the Q&A or later. But yeah, you would put those into the spreadsheet and then see, okay, across all of these 3. And if you wanted to, you can make it more complicated by weighting them as well, which I won't get into now because they were most interested in preschool meals, but we also want to take into account, what their attendance is like. And then it would give you, it'd be a statistical kind of outcome, but it essentially would just be a list of these are the 10 schools which are closest based on whatever you kind of care most about.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Belinda. Okay, great. I will close this one down. Jump back to the slides. Just checking how we're doing for time. Okay, let's get this next one done. We may have to make the last one a bonus that I record a video on. It is quite complicated, but let's definitely do this one around attendance, and then we can check in on how we're doing for time. We could also, if we don't get too many questions, we can also loop back to the last one in the Q&A section. But this one I did want to cover because I think this will be interesting to people. So this is a case where rather than demographics, what Mohammed is interested in is attendance. in particular. So, and yeah, the case study, this might be a familiar kind of example that people are in, where you're working, maybe you've done a pilot in one area and then you're looking to expand, or it might be a bit to kind of Belinda's point, potentially it could be a school or a cluster of schools you've worked with, and you, if it's working, then you want to know, which schools are similar to the schools we're working with, and this will just be a relatively simple example. So if we go to the pupil absence data, again, these all look very similar. So you'd be able to review kind of the top level data here, and then you would download the file. And I'll just jump straight to this one because in the interest of time, because this is the one we need. So this would be the data that's per, sorry, let's pull it up here. This would be the data that's per school. So I'll just quickly do a similar sort of thing just to show you what you might want to look at. So again, I would look at school. So the school, I would quickly check what we're looking at. So this is actually an example where there's multiple data points. So what you might want to do first is just look for the most, filter this just for the most recent data. And then let's say you were working in Camden, for the sake of argument, I think that was the example I was looking at. Let's see.
So just to say, in this example, each row is a school, a unique combination of school and year. So one school would have, like, I think there were 4 different year data points. Sometimes I find a thing that can be helpful to do is to just pick like one school, and then you can easily see how it's structured. Like if you filter or just choose a random school, then you can see the structure.
Yeah, I definitely agree that that's helpful. And then this is a bit like what we talked about earlier. This is where you do have the phase kind of available. And so now we're looking at state-funded secondaries in Camden for the most recent year. So that's kind of keeping track of what you've filtered down to. And in this case, you've got, again, lots of different columns that we won't touch on, but the one which is quite often used is persistent absence. So this would give you the percentage of pupils who are persistently absent, so absence of over 10% for the terms that we're looking at. And these could be, so it might be that if you're Mohammed, these are the schools that you're working with already. So this would just give you a sense of, which schools have the highest persistent absence, basically. But if you wanted to look at the local authority level, which is one of the questions which came up earlier, then I'll just quickly show one of those files very quickly. So this file, and this is helpful actually, because this will help kind of, again, with this unique rows point. So this file is a little bit different. So this is now local authorities, not schools. And again, we want to make sure we're looking at only the most recent year in this case, in this example. And then this is one, again, where you've got phase. So let's just look for secondary. And then let's take out, I'm doing this quite quickly, I appreciate, but hopefully this will be helpful just to give people an introduction. Take out where we don't have local authority information. And now what we're looking at, just to sort of step back, is local authority level data for secondaries for the latest year, and this would roll up all of their schools together. But you would have the same column. So this is saying, for example, in Camden, there's 10 schools in the data, and then this would be the data for all of their schools. And if we're looking at the same column, the persistent absent, percentage of pupils that are persistently absent, you could sort that, and this will give you the local authorities which have the highest to lowest persistent absence in secondary. And this is you'd identify maybe that in this case study for Mohammed, that this is where they're currently working. And then what you might want to do, so you could either, in this case, Camden is one of the relatively higher ones, but so it may be that you don't want to sort of, if you are looking to expand the program, you might not want to necessarily go right to the top of the list. It might be that you go sort of down from where you are, but this would all depend on the kind of work that you're doing. And maybe, for the sake of argument, Islington is like a neighbouring borough, and it's got very similar and high persistent absence. So if I was doing this work, obviously in a more systematic way, that might be the type of conversation I'd be having with them, is to say, this is a local borough. There may be reasons why you may not want to work locally, but if you did, then, they have kind of similar levels, which are also high for persistent absence. So that could be an example. So that's a good kind of case study on the local authority stuff. I'm just going to quickly jump back to the school level and just give a sense of trends over time, because I think that's an important thing we haven't covered yet. So this is a good file to do it in because it's got all of the data in the file. So if we look at, as Dulcie mentioned, let's do an example here. So let's look for just Regent High School. So I'm just looking at one school now. So that's their one row. But if I take off the filter that's about academic year, we now have several rows. So one row, they're in reverse order, but one row for each academic year for this one school. And so this would give you a sense of, in this case, the fact that persistent absence has gone up from 34% to 42% across those years for that school. And this is what I was going to do this live, but this was one that I prepared earlier, just in case we were a bit short on time. Within this file, you can relatively simply pull together. So this is now looking in Camden at all the schools across the years. How have things changed? And this is not as pretty as the work I normally like to try and produce, but hopefully this gives a sense of the type of things that you can do with this data. So what I've done here is just done a difference between.
Sorry, can you zoom in again?
Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting. I've got a massive screen here. Sorry.
Folks can also zoom in on their own Zoom thing, but I find this is nicer. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Just to sort of step back, this is now looking, persistent absence, these are percentages for all the schools in Camden, secondary schools over time. And then this column, I just did a simple difference between the first year we've got and the last year. And so this gives you a sense that, like this school, for example, things have gone up, and this isn't uncommon, as people will probably know on this call, but it's still quite shocking every time you look at it, that this was in 2020, 18% were already persistently absent, which would have been considered relatively high then, and that's gone up to 41% of pupils in the latest data. And again, I've kind of put things on the chart here, which we don't need to get into, but that's the type of thing you can do if you've got a bit more time, is to kind of visualize these things. And the reason for this, as I mentioned a bit at the start of the call, would be twofold potentially. One would be as just a bit more of a nuanced way to still do targeting, or what I would call targeting, but basically identifying schools with needs that match your service. Essentially, you may, for example, I would often look at schools which were high and have decreased a lot, so those might be a different different kind of use case to schools which are already low and have got even lower, for example. So you kind of I would ideally want a sense of where schools are at, and also where kind of what their direction of travel is, because I think both of those things can be useful when you're starting to work, particularly when you're starting to work with the school, to know, essentially, like whether so say they were one of the schools with high persistent absence in Camden, whether it's always been that way, or whether it's a new thing. That's kind of quite a helpful diagnostic in terms of your service design, typically. And then the other one would be a bit around evaluation. So we've got a slide which I'll get to shortly around kind of the challenges with this, but it can be a useful. So if you've got no other kind of data available, this can be a useful way to kind of check progress of the work you're doing. So that the caveats to that are that this would typically be for the whole school, or for a pupil group, like all disadvantaged pupils. So if you're working with 10 pupils in an intensive way in the school, this won't help you, to be frank. But if you've got a more of a whole school approach, then it may be that this is a type of thing where you'd be able to say, okay, we started working with these two schools in Camden 5 years ago. what does their trajectory look like compared to all the other schools in Camden, would be one type of thing I would do in my work, for example. So you could say, okay, maybe persistent absence has gone up in those 2 schools we've worked with, but by 3%, whereas all the other schools in Camden went up by 20%. So that's telling you something, and then sort of unpicking how much of that can be attributed to your work versus anything else is obviously always the challenge there. I think I just wanted to show something on trends to kind of highlight that kind of general idea, because I think it can be useful for people to get a sense of trend as well as kind of the latest data. Okay, great. Dulcie, I'll jump back to the slides. Do you think it's worth skipping over the last one for now and maybe coming back to it to make sure we get everything covered? And then, yeah, as I say, I can always do a quick recording of the last example for people who are interested. I think that's the best approach.
Yeah, that sounds good. We can, I mean, if people don't have any particular questions, then we can tackle that one. But otherwise, what we can do for the last example, which was definitely the most complicated, is Tom's very generously offered to like record a demo, which we can include when we share out the slides. Because we are running a little bit over time. And we did have a planned break, but I'm thinking that it could be more if you need to go pop and get a glass of water or something, please feel free. But otherwise we can just mention the limitations and then tackle some of the Q&A to make sure that people get what they need. So Tommy, if you want to talk about limitations, then we can just jump into any particular questions people have.
Yeah, I can do these really quickly. So, but just to kind of, clarify. So the data, there's a time lag on when it's published. So that's one thing to consider. So you wouldn't get attendance data for up to, 6 to 9 months after the term. Like that's not the best example because they're starting to make changes around that, but that's the type of thing that will happen quite a lot. So you don't have the most kind of up-to-date information. What I just talked about already. So these things will either cover the full school or a relatively large subgroup of pupils. So if you're working with small groups, typically evaluation won't be possible with this data. Even with large groups, it's challenging, but there's sort of more interesting things that you can do, at least for internal use. And then the final one, as we kind of touched on a bit as I was jumping around those spreadsheets with a lot of columns and rows and stuff, they can be a bit unwieldy. I think, I would recommend anyone who has time and the interest to maybe spend some time with them, because once you kind of get going, you can do some really interesting things. And a lot of the things that are tricky are the same for all of these data sets. So once you've kind of worked out one, they're all the same. But it's, just to say that you sometimes need to be a bit careful with what you're pulling out of them, just to be 100% sure that what you've done essentially with your analysis. Okay, great. Yeah, I will. I think we'll take a pause there and maybe just jump straight into any questions. And if there aren't too many, we can go back to the last case study.
Yeah. Do you want to stop sharing for a second? And thank you also so much. There's a lot of information packed in there, which I hope was helpful for folks. Definitely, I learned some things. There was one question that came up in the chat that's relevant to like the kind of limitations, which was, can the data sets be revised? Like, could there be not just like an annual release, but different versions? And does the data change within them depending on when they were downloaded? I'm wondering if, for example, that happens with like as we get more accurate A-level results, for example.
Yes, most common. So sometimes there will just be a mistake in there and they'll republish it. So if you downloaded it and done some analysis, you can sign up for updates to all of the individual things, which can be helpful if it's something that's really critical. But the ones which do change a lot, which I meant to mention actually on the A-level case study, is that they will put out provisional data, what they call provisional data, and then validated data for some of these things. So the key stage 5 data we just looked at on this session is provisional from last year. And then I think in January, probably, they're going to put out the final data and it will change, typically not by much. It depends exactly what you're trying to do. But normally, in that case, it's around remarks, generally speaking. So pupils who have request a remark, or schools may take whole pupils out of the performance tables for various different reasons, so the numbers will change slightly. So yeah, that is that's definitely worth keeping a track of especially if it's kind of very important that it's exactly right for whatever you're doing. You kind of want to keep a track of whether the data is provisional or validated, and also whether they've republished it since you downloaded it and they realized there was a mistake in there.
Yeah, okay, that's super helpful. And so I guess just a couple notes. I think in any analysis it can be I would recommend like noting like the link to and the specific like version or date if there's not like a version number of the data set that you use. So you could say like I used the key stage 2 attainment data that was published on 11th of September 2025. And that way like for your records. But the provisional data sets have the word provisional in the title as well, I've just discovered. So that could be a helpful flag. Cool, thank you. That's super helpful. Okay, so we have nearly 15 minutes, I would say, for questions. So if anybody has a particular question, whether that's could you please show me again how to do this thing that you showed, or there were, I think, 5 people who said, I really need this particular data for my project, or I'm having a challenge with the data set I'm using. Please just you can use the raise hand function on Zoom, or you can come off camera and like gesture in some obvious way. You can also write your question in the chat and we can take a few questions and try to tackle those in the next sort of 10-15 minutes. And alternatively, if there aren't any particular questions. Oh, yeah, we've got a question.
Can I just ask one?
If
the parameters change, Tom, so PA, if it's different, are we always just comparing like with like, just to check? So we're never going back to when maybe something was measured in a different way when we're looking at the data sets. Is that right? It's always measured from whenever.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. If it's all in the same file, normally they'll have recalculated it for the old years. So yeah, in the persistent, the PA example.
Just use that for an example because they did change that.
They changed it. Yeah, so they went back and recalculated what it would have been and then made that available. If it's in different files, and especially if they were published at different times, you have to be a bit more careful. Especially if they call it the same thing. Often, like so with key stage 4, like where they change the expected, like the grade system or what the level should be every year, then normally it's clear from the files and they wouldn't go back, generally speaking. But yeah, it's a really good example in the case of PA, or sometimes like with GCSEs, the thing to be careful of is whether you're looking at whether you are looking at grade 5 and above or grade 4 and above in today's way of doing things. That type of thing. Sometimes they'll use different ones, but yeah, I think generally if it's in the same file, it's safe to assume that it's been recalculated. But if it's in different old files and it just says PA, then it's probably using the old. They wouldn't be comparable, basically.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Belinda.
Okay, we've got a question in the chat as well. Thank you very much. Very informative and practical. There's a question about having multiple year data in different files. Is there a way to merge the files to see trends? Is there a way to automate the merging? I guess this is more of a bit of a data processing question versus a open data specifically question. Is that something that?
I can cover that one quickly.
Chime in if helpful.
Yeah, I'm sure. Be good to get your thoughts on it. But so you have to be a bit careful of the point Belinda raised around what if they are in different files, what's in them. But if they look like they're exactly the same, there's different technical approaches. What I would do if I was just interested myself quickly would be to get them as different tabs in the same Excel file, and then do hopefully a relatively simple way to look up. So you'd have one column which is this is from this file, and then another column which is for the same school. This is the data from last year, and then you can look at those things on the same row. That's how I would do it. You have to be careful that you're getting the unique row, a bit like what we've kind of covered a few times today. You got, like, especially if you're doing a lookup or something like that, technically you just have to be a bit careful. And then the other thing to be aware of, which is a bit related to the point Linda raised, is around where URNs change. So for a school, the safest thing to do is if it doesn't match on URN, so that'd be the unique identifier for a school, then the safest thing is just to assume that you can't compare those two things. There are cases where the URN's changed and it's essentially the same school, but they're under new governance or something like that. So in those cases, it gets a bit more complicated, and maybe I won't get too into that, but just to be aware that you may end up with a lot, depending on how far apart the two data points are, you may end up with a lot of schools where it says there was no data in the previous time point because their URN will have changed, which technically you shouldn't, depends how you want to do it, but it's safest just to not compare those two schools anyway. But that's how I do it. And then maybe Dulcie, you could jump in, but there'd be more sort of involved ways where you could pull all the data into like one table or one database and then go from there. Those would probably be your options.
Yeah, I think that's probably the easiest option as well, to use Excel or Google Sheets or what have you. I mean, in terms of an automated way, like you could do it programmatically if you're comfortable using like a scripting language like R, Python. I'm most familiar with R, and there are some nice packages in R. If you don't use R, you can safely ignore this sentence, but there's some nice packages. There's one called Janitor that can compare column names across different data sets and like see if they are, like, at least in terms of how things are named, capturing the same information. So I, again, like Tom would be looking at, like, are the unique identifiers the same? And then to see if you can safely join. But automating it, you probably want to use scripting language, or potentially, I'm not as knowledgeable about the capabilities of like Power BI, et cetera, to do that, but potentially do something like that. And you could also check as well to see if that data is available, like in a aggregated file. Like Tom was showing that some of the data sets do have multi-year data in them. So potentially, if you look back on that link that we originally shared, the multi-year data could be there as well. We have another really good question as well, from Dan. I'm conscious that folks might be jumping off as well, and so just before we do a couple more questions, I just want to request that you fill in our feedback survey. We really do look at this data, and it's really helpful for us to know what you liked, what you didn't like, and what else you want to know about. So if there's things that you want to know, like, I want to know about a specific open data sets, I want to know about visualizing data more, like, please tell us. We look at this, and that's how we make decisions about what we're going to do next year. So please fill that in. It also helps us continue to get funding to do it. But Dan's got a really good question. We're talking about open data and the data that's published freely. What would you say are the differences and strengths and weaknesses between this open data set versus a more restricted data set, so the National Pupil Database? So maybe you could just start by just explaining for folks what the National Pupil Database is, how you might get access, and then what it contains versus these open data sets.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yes, the National Pupil Database is the database that the DFE holds that has all of the actual pupil level data in, that they then use to create what we've just been looking at today. But in their database, it would say, like, Tom Shirley got this GCSE, this grade in his GCSE maths on this date, whatever. So they'd have that going back years for every pupil. So there's a lot of detail in there, and to get access to it, you need to have certain training and make a request. So it has to have like public benefit and obviously there's a lot of things around data security and privacy that you have to kind of do. But to Dan's question, the detailed breakdowns So often the thing that will be most useful is if you work with a cohort which is has multiple demographic characteristics, would be one example. So you want to focus on pupils who are FSM and got certain key stage 2 results and this and that, etc. Like you wouldn't be able to get open data on that, but you could apply all of those filters and then get that information from the National Pupil Database. So really, it does allow you to get into a bit more detail if you've got a very specific cohort or a specific KPI that you use. So if you only care about like GCSE 9 to 7 grades 9 to 7 or something, that wouldn't be published, but you could work that out for every school or whatever you wanted to do. And I will just, so it's definitely worth looking into, although it can be quite involved to get access. I will just quickly add that's sort of an in-between thing that people might find useful is you can make freedom of information requests to the National Pupil Database, which people at the DFE probably won't thank me for saying, but that's what I will do from time to time, and it creates work for them, so you don't want to do it for no reason. But if you wanted to request something that's aggregated but is specific, so say that 9 to 7 example, I'm not sure if they would do this one, but if you wanted to know, so like what percentage of pupils get grade 9 to 7 in the GCSEs at every school in the country, you could probably request that and they would do it at the school level. It still wouldn't, and then it wouldn't have anything to do with pupils in it. So that's the other thing to flag. And you have to be, when you make those requests, it helps if you can be quite specific, because they'll only do it if they understand obviously what you're asking and think that it's possible with what data they've got. So it helps to know what's in the National Pupil Database before you make those requests, just so you can be sure that it's possible. But yeah, that's another thing which maybe is a session for another day, but it's worth flagging that it is, if you do have something very specific and you don't need it urgently, that's a route you could look down, is putting in a freedom of information request for the data. Then it becomes open data essentially at that point. Not quite in the same way, but there can be different terms associated with how you use it. So you have to be a bit careful with it. But you're happy to take any questions by email on that type of thing if that kind of piques anyone's interest.
Yeah, super interesting. And one thing that we've toyed with as well at DataKind is whether it would be helpful at all for us to try to get kind of researcher level access to the National Pupil Database, and then potentially offer as a service like support designing research questions and like accessing that data, because we kind of have the capacity to do that and could support organizations. It's not something that we've done, it's something that I've thought about. So if that is something that is of interest to anybody, again, just like maybe pop that in the feedback, because it was just an idea that I had one day. Okay, we've got a couple minutes and we have one last question in the chat, which is if you want to kind of continuously ingest this data in like a reliable way, like you're using this data routinely, is there do you have any advice about how to do that in a consistent, reliable way? Into a database or data warehouse, for example. It looks like they have an API, the DFE have an API, but I don't know if you have a go-to method.
No, I have my own methods, which have slowly kind of developed over the years. So I have a database with basically all the open data in it, which I update when it comes out. But in terms of doing it often the way I tend to do it, it'll be on a per data set basis. So it's automated, but there's like a script, as Dulcie was talking about earlier, for each one. They have been trying to launch this API for a while. I haven't actually looked at it, I must say, recently, so I won't speak too much to it. I'll give it another look, but there's been talk for a number of years of having an API that would mean you wouldn't have to do what I've been doing for like 10 years basically, and it would be hopefully it would be more accessible, so that would be great. And it kind of goes back and forth when it's going to be finalized, so I kind of stick to what I do, but I would definitely keep an eye on that, because that's, yeah, really, that's going to be the best. If you're especially if you're starting from scratch, that's going to be the best approach, probably, just to set up something that uses that for the schools or the areas that you care about. And that kind of goes a bit to the previous question as well, in terms of if you did want to build up data over time. In theory, that API should be able to do that, but there's been some complications with it over the years.
Cool. Okay. Lots of questions. So just to wrap up, first off, a big thank you to you, Tom, for taking the time to like walk through these examples. Yeah, it was really helpful. And we're very grateful for your time. Thank you to the folks at JRF and the Insight Infrastructure team, particularly for hosting this today. And thank you to everyone who attended and engaged with questions. It's really helpful for us to know also what you want to know. We will be circulating the slides with everybody, and we'll post the recording. We'll also share alongside that the kind of walkthrough of that fourth case study, which was definitely the most complicated example around looking at like science GCSE attainment. So that we'll have that for you. And again, please just fill in our feedback form whether you loved this or hated it. It's just really helpful for us to know how else we can support the sector. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. And thank you again, Tom. And hopefully see some of you at our next panel in a few weeks.
Thanks, everyone.